General Hospital spoilers for next week, July 7th to July 11th tease that Sonny was no longer a grieving father, he was a man preparing for war. Ever since the fire that gutted Charlie's pub and nearly killed Christina, something inside him had shifted. The blaze wasn't just an act of destruction, it was a declaration of war against his family. A calculated strike meant to hurt him in the most personal way. And Sonny, whose empire had withstood decades of violence, betrayal, and blood, now found himself possessed by a single obsession. To uncover who had dared to light that match. He wasn't grieving anymore. He was hunting. At first, all signs pointed to Sidwell. The man had always operated in shadows, weaving through networks of corruption and influence with serpentine precision. But the more Sonny pulled at the threads, the more the picture changed. The fire hadn't been random. It had been perfectly timed, executed with intimate knowledge of Christina's schedule, the bar's security, and the blind spots in Sonny's own defenses. That kind of detail didn't come from a stranger. That kind of betrayal came from the inside. And that's when Sonny's suspicions began to settle, like a slow, tightening grip, around Marco. Marco had been hailed as a hero. The man who dragged Christina from the flames just before the roof collapsed. But to Sonny, the timing felt too precise, the rescue too perfect. The more he thought about it, the more his instincts screamed. Marco had been there too fast. He had moved too confidently. His story had no holes, and that, to Sonny, was the biggest red flag of all. The best lies are the ones rehearsed in advance. But Sonny didn't say anything. He kept his suspicions locked behind his cold eyes and steely silence. Instead, he acted. Quietly, methodically. He mobilized old contacts, WSB informants, former enforcers, private surveillance techs. He started collecting everything, Marco's digital trail. Surveillance camera footage from the days before the fire, hidden bank records, encrypted calls. He ordered bugs placed in places Marco would never suspect, and trackers attached to his vehicle. No one, not even Jason, knew just how deep Sonny was digging. Because if Marco was the one who lit that fire, Sonny wasn't going to turn him over to the cops. He was going to bury him. The obsession grew by the hour. Sonny replayed the fire in his mind every night, every detail etched into his thoughts like a scar. He saw Christina crawling through the smoke. He heard her coughing, gasping for air. And he saw Marco, sprinting in like a savior, arms outstretched. But now Sonny saw something different in that moment, calculation, not panic. Precision, not desperation. It was a performance. A staged rescue to cover the crime itself. And Sonny couldn't ignore it any longer. Jason was the first to sense that something was shifting. He saw it in Sonny's silence, more dangerous than shouting. He saw it in the way Sonny stopped answering questions, in how he spent hours locked in his office. In the growing list of names he was suddenly looking into. Carly saw it too. The way he barely spoke at dinner. The way his jaw clenched every time Christina mentioned Marco. Even Dante noticed the cold edge in his father's voice whenever Marco's name came up. Sonny wasn't just suspicious, he was preparing for something. Something final. And Marco? Either he was oblivious, or he was playing a very dangerous game. He continued showing up for Christina, still acting like the loyal friend, the selfless rescuer. But that made Sonny angrier. It was one thing to betray him. It was another to exploit his daughter's trauma to keep up the illusion. Every smile Marco gave Christina, every gentle word, now felt like a weapon in disguise, a manipulation so vile that Sonny could barely contain his rage. But Sonny didn't explode. Not yet. He was waiting. Watching. Testing. Because he knew that once he made his move, there would be no turning back. This wasn't about empire or territory. This was about blood. About family. And if Marco had betrayed him, Sonny wouldn't hesitate. There would be no mercy. No courtroom. just consequences. His obsession with the truth had consumed him completely. The fire had scorched more than a building, it had burned away the last remnants of Sunny's restraint. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. Every second was spent piecing together a puzzle he was already certain of. He didn't need proof to act. He needed confirmation to justify what he already planned to do. The line between truth and vengeance had blurred, and Sunny was walking that line with terrifying precision. In the shadows of Port Charles, Sunny was preparing for the moment when the truth would finally slip from Marco's lips, or when the last shred of evidence would land in his hands. And when that happened, there would be no warning. No hesitation. Sunny would strike with the fury of a father who had been pushed too far. And this time, the ashes left behind wouldn't be from a bar. They'd be from a man who thought he could betray Sunny Corinthos and survive it. Drew was consumed by the image of perfection he had constructed for his upcoming wedding. Clinging to every detail as if the ceremony itself could erase the fractured history that still lingered behind his eyes. To the outside world, he appeared calm, composed. A reformed man walking proudly toward a future with Willow, but beneath the polished surface was a mind calculating every move with surgical precision. This wedding was not merely an expression of love, it was a strategic maneuver to solidify his power, to manipulate public sentiment, and to tether Willow so tightly to his side that she would never again question his intentions. Every flower, every guest list, every minute of the schedule was orchestrated to reinforce the illusion of unity, love, and triumph. Yet behind this tightly controlled facade, a storm was gathering, and it carried the name Nina. Nina had felt it long before anyone else dared to say it aloud, that something was deeply wrong, that Drew's affection toward Willow was laced with possessiveness. That his plans for the wedding were less about building a life together and more about cementing control. She watched with growing dread as Willow, once fierce and full of quiet rebellion, became subdued, hesitant, repeating Drew's words as if they were hers, isolated from those who might challenge the path she was on. Nina's concern twisted into obsession as the date approached. And every attempt to reach Willow was met with indifference, a hollow smile, or the gentle yet troubling assertion that Drew knew what was best. Nina, desperate to stop what she believed would be a disaster, began investigating. She dug into Drew's business dealings, traced his communications, reached out to people who knew him before the war. Before the reinvention, before the lies took shape. What she found was enough to make her tremble, evidence of manipulation, of concealed power plays, of psychological coercion hidden beneath a mask of devotion. And with that knowledge, she knew she could not stay silent. But Drew, always watching, always 5 steps ahead, began to sense resistance. He tightened his grip on the narrative, adjusted the wedding plans to remove potential threats, and made quiet calls to ensure that no last-minute surprises would derail what he had worked so ruthlessly to build. He convinced Willow to keep the ceremony small, selective, claiming it was for her comfort, while strategically isolating her from voices that might awaken doubt. But still, the unease rippled beneath every surface. And those closest to them began to notice the forced nature of Drew's affection, the way Willow hesitated before speaking, the way her eyes flickered toward escape before returning to his. Then came the first rupture, a leak to the press detailing Drew's involvement in reshaping a medical board decision regarding Willow's treatment, a move that reeked of influence and desperation. It exploded across the news cycle, casting doubt on the entire foundation of their relationship and dragging into the light the manipulative undertones that Nina had feared. Drew's team scrambled to contain it, to deny, to reframe the story, but the damage was already embedded. Willow confronted Drew, her voice shaking not with anger, but with the heavy weight of awakening, asking questions he couldn't deflect, demanding truths he had never prepared to reveal. And as he floundered under her gaze, the carefully built mask began to slip, revealing the intensity beneath, the entitlement, the possessiveness, the hunger for control disguised as love. In that moment, Willow saw what Nina had been screaming in silence for weeks: this wedding wasn't salvation, it was entrapment. But Drew wouldn't surrender. The exposure had only made him more determined to secure what he believed was rightfully his. He intensified his efforts to convince Willow, to charm the public, to portray himself as the victim of political sabotage, all while Nina faced the consequences of her interference, vilified by some and hailed by others, yet unwilling to back down. She had pulled the first thread and now watched as Drew's empire of illusion began to unravel, not with an explosion, but with a quiet, relentless collapse. And still, the wedding loomed. A ticking clock that no one could stop, not entirely. The question now was not whether the ceremony would happen, but what truth would be revealed when it did, and whether Willow, standing at the edge of a life built on deception, would have the strength to walk away before the vows were spoken. Jason and Jocelyn had begun their quiet but relentless search into the secrets buried beneath the name Dalton, a man whose reputation in the scientific world had long been cloaked in shadow. Surrounded by rumors of unethical research, experimental cloning, and genetic manipulation that reached far beyond the boundaries of any government-sanctioned project. What started as a lead rooted in speculation quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous. As each piece of information uncovered led not to clarity but to chaos, a maze of corrupted medical files, erased hospital records, and cryptic communications hidden behind layers of military encryption. The deeper they dug, the more they realized they weren't just unearthing a conspiracy, they were cracking open a vault of horrors that had already reshaped lives in Port Charles, and possibly brought someone back from the brink of death. And at the center of this storm, like a ghost refusing to remain buried, was Britt. For Jocelyn, the investigation was deeply personal. Her fear of what Sunny was becoming, her thirst for truth in a world increasingly shaped by deception, had drawn her into a partnership with Jason that no one saw coming. It wasn't built on trust in the traditional sense, it was forged in urgency, in mutual understanding that the old rules of loyalty and silence no longer applied. Jason, usually silent and cautious, had broken his code for this. Because Dalton's name kept appearing in places it shouldn't, on archived GH files that had been marked confidential. In connection with patients who were declared dead but never buried, and in anonymous tips about a private lab believed to be funded through off-the-books WSB money. It was no longer a question of theory. Someone was moving bodies, rewriting DNA, and possibly resurrecting lives that were never meant to return. That's when it happened. Confirmation, quiet, clinical, but undeniable. Britt was alive. The news came not in a dramatic reveal, but in a single recovered data string, pulled from a corrupted hard drive Jason had traced to an abandoned WSB satellite site. A brief entry, subject BW-11, stabilized. Viable. Contained. No location. No dates. No explanation. But the initials were unmistakable, and the attached genome sequence, though partially scrambled, matched a previous blood sample from Britt filed years ago at General Hospital. She hadn't died in the way everyone believed. Her body had never been returned for burial. There had always been whispers, contradictions in the official narrative, but no one dared question it. Until now. This truth didn't bring relief. It brought new terror. Because if Britt was alive, then what had been done to her? Had she consented to this? Was she truly herself? Or had Dalton used her as a prototype, an experiment in resurrection, in memory tampering, in bodily reconstruction? And if he had done it once, how many others had followed? Suddenly, the lines between life and death, between human and construct, began to blur. And Jason understood that this wasn't just about saving Britt, it was about preventing whatever Dalton had created from consuming them all. The danger wasn't theoretical anymore. Jocelyn and Jason were now targets. They knew too much. Surveillance began following them, cars that vanished when approached, encrypted messages warning them to cease unauthorized access. And one late-night breach into Jocelyn's apartment that left no signs of robbery, only a lingering scent of antiseptic and a single printed line left on her kitchen table, "She's awake. You should not be." The message was clear, someone didn't want Britt found. Or worse, someone didn't want Britt remembering who she truly was. And yet, Jocelyn couldn't turn back. Her obsession with Dalton had transformed into a mission not just for truth, but for accountability. Jason, meanwhile, had been forced to reckon with his past feelings for Britt. Now colliding violently with the possibility that she had been exploited, altered, or even remade. They followed the trail to a remote lab location rumored to be in the Adirondacks, where whispers of human trials were conducted under the guise of cryogenic sleep. No one ever emerged from that facility unchanged. If it still existed, it could be the last place Britt was held, or worse, the place where her humanity was stripped away. But they weren't alone. Sidwell's network had already picked up their movements. The WSB, fractured internally, had operatives who believed in the secrecy of the Dalton program and others who wanted it destroyed. The deeper Jason and Jocelyn moved into the shadows, the more they became pawns in a war between truth and control, between exposing the horrors of the past and maintaining the illusion of safety for the future. With each step forward, the tension mounted, Jocelyn's defiance grew sharper, Jason's resolve hardened, and the memory of Britt, once thought dead, now loomed over them like a ticking clock. There was no telling what they would find if they reached her. Would Britt still be the woman Jason once knew? Or had Dalton's experiment transformed her into something entirely new, something weaponized, fragmented, unstable? And if she remembered what was done to her, would she even want to be saved? Port Charles had no idea that the greatest threat it now faced wasn't a mob war or a political scandal. It was the resurrection of a life never meant to return. And the battle for Britt's future, if it still existed, had only just begun. Kai had made a decision that would change everything, a single conversation that unraveled weeks of covert strategy, sacrifice, and emotional landmines. When he revealed Curtis's secret plan to locate Jacinda to Drew, he believed he was doing the right thing, that sharing the truth would prevent greater destruction. But what he failed to anticipate was the immediate and explosive fallout that would ripple through the lives of those Curtis had risked everything to protect. The moment Drew was brought into the loop, the shadows surrounding the operation began to crack, and with them came a wave of threats, suspicion, and danger that placed Portia and Trina directly in the crosshairs. Curtis had operated under the radar for a reason. His mission to find Jacinda was never just about locating a woman in hiding. It was about extracting a witness whose testimony could dismantle everything Drew had rebuilt since his return to Port Charles. Jacinda held truths not just about Drew's past but about his calculated rise, his manipulation of systems, and the lies he had fed to protect his empire. She was a ticking bomb. And Curtis had chosen silence over disclosure because he knew the risks. But now that Kai had spoken, the fuse had been lit, and Drew was already making moves to suppress what was coming. Not with negotiation, but with quiet threats and surgical sabotage. And in the middle of it all stood Portia and Trina. Women who had nothing to do with the war that had begun but who were now suffering its consequences in real time. It started small, Trina receiving cryptic messages from unknown numbers. Photos of her walking alone, whispers about her safety at the university. Portia's hospital account suddenly locked, flagged for compliance irregularities she had never committed. Strange cars lingering too long outside their home. Doors left ajar that had been locked. The tension grew so suffocating that Portia was forced to pull Trina out of classes, choosing protection over peace of mind. The message was clear, they were being watched, and the warning was not subtle. For Curtis, the betrayal cut deeper than any wound. Kai was someone he had taken under his wing, trusted with the kind of silence that required both loyalty and restraint. Now, that silence was shattered. Curtis wasn't just angry, he was terrified. Because he knew Drew. He knew the precision with which Drew eliminated obstacles. And Jacinda, if she was still alive and willing to talk, was the greatest obstacle of all. By exposing the plan to find her, Kai hadn't just endangered Curtis, he had painted a target on everyone Curtis loved. The obsession grew like wildfire. Curtis stopped sleeping. He changed phones twice in 1 week. He moved Portia and Trina to a secured location without telling anyone, not even Jordan. He started operating as if every step was monitored. Every conversation recorded. And in truth, he wasn't wrong. Drew had already mobilized his network, spinning the story to key allies, positioning himself as the victim of another smear campaign. He painted Jacinda as unstable, Curtis as compromised, and began weaving a narrative that allowed him to stay ahead of public scrutiny. But behind closed doors, he was pulling strings, tracking Kai's movements, freezing the accounts Curtis had used to fund his search, even deploying influence over law enforcement to stall any independent investigation. Meanwhile, Trina was growing angrier. She knew her father was keeping things from her again. She could feel the panic every time her mother held her hand for too long. Every time someone looked over their shoulder before speaking. Trina had been through too much to pretend she didn't recognize danger when it walked into the room. And now, with each new threat, she felt herself slipping into old fear, of losing control, of watching her family get torn apart by forces she couldn't see. But this time, she didn't want to stay quiet. She began asking questions. Digging into Kai's connections, following leads of her own, despite the danger. Because if someone was threatening them, she needed to know why. She needed to know who Jacinda really was, and why Drew was willing to risk everything to silence her. Portia, for her part, remained composed on the surface but was unraveling internally. She had watched Drew lie, manipulate, and dismantle reputations with a smile. She had warned Curtis months ago that involving Jacinda could pull them into a fire they couldn't control. And now that fire was here. Every shift at the hospital felt like a countdown. Every encounter with Drew felt like a trap disguised as civility. She clutched every moment with Trina tighter, knowing how quickly it could all be taken from her. And in the heart of it all, Kai was spiraling. What he had done, he believed, had been out of conscience. But now he saw the destruction left in its wake. Curtis barely looked at him. Trina wouldn't speak to him. And the person he had told, Drew, was now weaponizing the information in ways Kai never imagined. He had thought the truth would protect people. Instead, it had endangered them. And the guilt was consuming him. What had begun as a mission to uncover one woman's truth had become a citywide reckoning. Port Charles was shifting. Loyalties were breaking. Power was being recalculated. And the cost of one revelation was already claiming its first victims. The search for Jacinda wasn't just about a name anymore. It had become the epicenter of a storm that would destroy everything in its path, and prove once again that in Port Charles, the most dangerous truths are always the ones buried in silence. Sidwell was no longer operating from the shadows, he was orchestrating chaos with calculated precision, and his next move was already in motion. After the fire that devastated Charlie's pub and nearly claimed Christina's life, the city of Port Charles believed it had witnessed the worst of Sidwell's vengeance. But they were wrong. That was only the beginning. Now, armed with new intelligence, access to insider blueprints, and a network of operatives who moved like ghosts, Sidwell was preparing to ignite the next blaze, this time, targeting another property tied directly to Sonny's legacy. It wouldn't just be another fire. It would be a message, louder, more violent, and far more personal than the first. This new plot wasn't just about destruction, it was about unraveling Sonny's world from the inside out. Sidwell's fixation had evolved into something more dangerous than revenge. It had become an obsession, a mission to dismantle every piece of Sonny's influence, starting with what he held most sacred. The next target was carefully chosen, a property linked not just to Sonny's business but to his memories, his family, his rise to power. Sidwell wanted to strike where it would bleed most, not financially, but emotionally. The plan was already underway, coded messages exchanged, tools placed, and vulnerable access points exposed. Sonny had always protected his empire like a fortress, but even fortresses can fall when the enemy knows exactly where the cracks lie. As whispers of another attack circulated in the underworld, tension began mounting. Jason caught wind of unusual chatter among security contractors, a strange uptick in surveillance disruptions near one of Sonny's warehouses, signs that something was wrong. But not yet fully formed. He brought it to Sonny immediately, and while Sonny was already on edge from the fallout of Charlie's pub, this new threat lit a darker fire within him. The man who had been wounded by betrayal was now cornered, and a cornered Sunny was the most dangerous kind. Still reeling from the suspicion surrounding Marco, still obsessed with protecting Christina, and still haunted by the idea that his enemies were now attacking his family directly, Sunny understood the truth that no one else dared say aloud: this was a war. And Sidwell had declared it without flinching. What made this moment even more volatile was that the damage to Sunny was already compounding. His allies were nervous. His resources were being stretched thin. His public image was taking hit after hit, and even those within his own circle began questioning whether Sunny could keep control. He was fighting on too many fronts, defending his children, holding back Jason's quiet warnings, managing Carly's growing fear, and wrestling with a paranoia that no longer felt irrational. Because now, the proof was everywhere. Security systems glitching. Anonymous tips about explosive materials found near one of his properties. An intercepted message warning: round 2 is coming. And this time, we won't miss. The psychological toll was mounting. Sunny, always a master of composure, was beginning to fracture. He snapped at those closest to him, paced restlessly through hallways that once made him feel untouchable, and stopped sleeping altogether. The scars from Charlie's pub weren't just physical, they had opened wounds in Sunny's psyche. Wounds Sidwell was now pressing on with cruel accuracy. The idea that he couldn't protect his legacy, his people, his home, it was becoming unbearable. Every new piece of intel confirming Sidwell's next move only tightened the noose around Sunny's resolve. Because this wasn't just about a fire. This was about erasure. Sidwell didn't want to hurt Sunny. He wanted to erase him. One piece of property, one daughter, one friend at a time. And as the next target loomed, Sunny was forced into a new kind of war, one that required not just muscle or bullets, but foresight, restraint, and trust. Trust he didn't know if he had any more. The damage had already reached too high, the risk too steep. The next fire, if successful, wouldn't just burn down a building. It would signal the beginning of Sunny's end. Unless he struck first. Unless he stopped waiting and started acting. But in doing so, he would have to embrace a version of himself he had fought for years to suppress. The man who didn't wait. The man who didn't forgive. The man who burned first.